Tennessee State Standard US 0.3 says to explain the impact of the Compromise of 1877, including Jim Crow laws, lynching, disenfranchisement, the efforts of Benjamin Pabst Singleton, and the Exeter's, along with the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. The Compromise of 1877 is the first thing that we're going to focus on right now. And this is a huge moment in American history, and it's going to have long-lasting ramifications for what's going on in the United States. First thing we got to understand before we can really talk about what the Compromise was is you got to understand what this term Reconstruction is. All right, so what Reconstruction was what happened after the Civil War in the South. And what it was the rebuilding of the South by the North after the Civil War. Okay, so it's where we rebuilt the South after the Civil War. And now it's not just, it sounds like it's just a construction project. It's not. Part of it is, and part of it is fixing some of the damages from the Civil War, but a lot of it is changing the way the South works. Mainly looking at racism, about ending slavery, that kind of stuff is going on. And the South is obviously going to resent this. They're not going to want to be reconstructed. They don't want their way of life to change. So while Reconstruction is going on, you're going to have this huge election that's going to happen, okay? And the election is the election of 1876. And the election of 1876 is what is going to lead to this Compromise of 1877. So in 1876, you had two candidates, and your two candidates are right down here. All right, the two candidates, you can see their pictures down here. The one on the left is Rutherford B. Hayes. And the one on the right is Samuel Tilden. And both of these guys are going to run for President of the United States. Rutherford B. Hayes is going to be supported by the North. All right, so I'm going to put a big N right here for him, supported by the North. And then Samuel Tilden is going to be supported by the South. And really what you have down is what happens is America votes based on where you live. People in the North voted for Rutherford B. Hayes. People in the South voted for Samuel Tilden. Now, when this election got going, it was a really close election. And whenever the votes were first counted, initially Samuel Tilden wins. But when we start looking closer at this election and trying to figure out, counting the votes, looking at the way it worked out, we realized, wait a second, something's not right here. And what had happened is Samuel Tilden, who was a Democrat, had cheated in southern states. And so all of these southern states where Samuel Tilden had cheated, where he had rigged the vote, these votes get cast out. And when they get thrown out, it creates a tie. All right, so let's just put down that Tilden had cheated in some states. These votes are thrown out. And that causes a tie. So literally what happens is no one can win the election. Okay, they can't get the needed amount of electoral votes to be considered the winner. So both candidates are just kind of sitting here trying to figure out who won. The North is saying Rutherford B. Hayes has to be the winner. He didn't cheat. The South is saying if it's not Samuel Tilden, we'll fight another civil war. And so America is literally back on this brink of civil war again. And so we have to figure out, who is the president? How's this going to work? So to figure that out, we come up with what's called the Compromise of 1877. So the election of 1876 is going to lead to this compromise. And the way compromises work, hopefully we know this, but in a compromise, each side is going to get something. You got to make each side happy. Each side has to give up a little bit, but they also get something. So the way the Compromise of 1877 works, the North, what they're going to get, the North sits down at the negotiating table for this compromise and say, look, you have to give us Rutherford B. Hayes as president. He's our guy. He won the election. He didn't cheat. Give us that. And the South goes, you know what? You can have that. So the North, in the Compromise of 1877, gets it Rutherford B. Hayes is president. And that's exactly what they wanted. They wanted Rutherford B. Hayes. They said, this guy deserves it. He didn't cheat. He's a quality guy. We want him as the president with this. Okay? And the South goes, okay, fair enough. Like, they give it to us. And then the South goes, oh, yeah, but now it's our turn. So here's what we want. And the South says, we want Reconstruction ended. So the South says, if we're going to give you that, you got to end Reconstruction. Now, you might think, well, what's the big deal? That seems like a good deal. The North gets their president. And while that's true, the problem here is Reconstruction wasn't done. The South wasn't fixed. The South still had tons and tons of problems that needed to be addressed. And the only way they were going to be addressed is during Reconstruction. Because during Reconstruction, the North was keeping soldiers down here, forcing the South to reconstruct at gunpoint. So when Reconstruction ends, this is not good. This is a huge mistake. So let's just put down that Reconstruction ending, put down that it was a, let's put down that it was a huge mistake. So it's a huge mistake. And that it leads to this new thing called segregation. So the problem is the South, like we said, the South is not done. They're not reconstructed. And when Northern troops leave, the South is now going to be free to do whatever they want when it comes to African Americans, to not necessarily go back and enslave them, but to put them in a second-class citizenship, which is what the South wanted. And if Northern troops had been down there, this never would have happened. But as soon as they leave, that's when you're going to start having all these problems that are going to start to develop. Because of the Compromise of 1877 and Reconstruction ended, like we said, the South is going to be left to their own devices, their own ways to handle this question of, how do we treat African Americans now that they're no longer slaves? And so the first court case that's really going to come to define the South for years to come is this court case called Plessy versus Ferguson. And the way court cases are named is they're named for the two people that are in the court case against each other. So what this court case was about, it was about a Louisiana streetcar. And in Louisiana, in these streetcars were segregated. Segregated is a really, really important term. We're going to talk about it a lot. What segregated means, it means to divide things up by race. So what this Louisiana city had done is they had segregated their streetcars, meaning they had certain cars that African Americans could ride, certain streetcars that only white Americans could ride. And so this court case said that is okay. You can segregate things. You can divide things up based on race. But the trick here is, under Plessy versus Ferguson, the big thing that it said, let's make sure we get this down, was that segregation was okay, but it must be separate but equal. So this new little phrase here, separate but equal, becomes a big thing in the South. So they say, look, you can divide things up based on race, but the streetcar for the white Americans has to be just as nice, can't be any better than the streetcar for the African Americans, and vice versa. They have to be equal. So in theory, it's not a terrible situation. However, in practice, it's not going to be good because the South is not going to keep things equal. They're going to segregate everything, but it's not going to be equal. And this picture down here at the bottom is a great example. This picture is what develops in the South. All right, so let's write that. This is what happens in the South. So this is the South's version of separate but equal. And if you look at it, this is a famous picture. You've got these two water fountains, right? You got the one on the left that's labeled white. So that would have been the segregated water fountain for white people. And if you look at this water fountain, circle where it says the white here, But if you look at it, this is a really nice water fountain, right? This is, it's got a big like cooling unit on it. It looks nice and clean. It's got a little lever there to control the flow of water. That's a pretty nice water fountain as far as water fountains go. But this one on the right, if you look at it, there's like this old rusty pipe that comes out and it goes to this little rinky-dink water fountain, right? It doesn't have a cooling unit. It's just, water coming straight from the wall. It's just not very nice. And this one is labeled as the colored water fountain. So it's pretty obvious if you compare these two are not equal. So what develops in the South is not separate but equal. It's separate and unequal. And this applies to everything. It's not just water fountains. It's waiting rooms for doctors' offices. It's movie theater seating where white Americans can sit, where African Americans can sit. It's laundromats. Everything gets segregated in the South because of this court case, Plessy versus Ferguson. Now, would this have happened if the North was down here with their military? Absolutely not. But Plessy versus Ferguson is an exact result of the North ending Reconstruction early. So the next thing that the South is going to start doing now that Reconstruction has ended is they start passing what are called Jim Crow laws. Now, what Jim Crow laws are racist laws in the South that take away African American, we'll put AA, rights. So these racist laws are going to be created. Now, once again, like we just said on that last slide, all of this is happening because that compromise of 1877, because the North said, nah, we're done reconstructing the South, let's let them do their own thing. So Jim Crow laws are going to start pass, and these Jim Crow laws are going to become very, very infamous for the things that they're going to do. All right, and they're going to, like we said, take away these African American rights. Now, one of the first and really important Jim Crow laws is going to start deal with voting, because technically, if you really got technical and you looked at the state constitutions, African Americans had the right to vote. But in the South, in this new unreconstructed South, that's not going to be good enough for the Southerners. So they're going to try to find ways to keep African Americans from voting. So what that is, this word right here, disenfranchisement. Yes, that's a big fancy word. Use it around your friends, make yourself sound smart. But what disenfranchisement means, it's where you lose your right to vote. So lose your right to vote. So if you're disenfranchised, it means that you can't vote. And so the South is going to try to start finding ways to disenfranchise African Americans. And some of the ways that they do this are sneaky, some are just blatantly obvious and they're just terrible. But the South has to keep African Americans from voting because they don't want African Americans to have equal rights. They don't want them to be able to have any say in their government. So there are 4 ways that African Americans are disenfranchised during this time period, right when Reconstruction was ended. The first way that they're disenfranchised, the way that they're kept from voting. Number 1, let's just put it down right here. Let's draw a little arrow so we got a little more space to write. Number 1 way that they're disenfranchised is violence. And I'm going to put in parentheses what's called lynching. So this is the first way that this happens. And what this means is basically if an African American did exercise their right to vote or tried to, maybe they showed up at the voting location and tried to vote. Usually groups of white Americans, sometimes led by the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, would show up and use violence to keep that from happening again. So they would beat them, they would intimidate them, and most famously what they would do is they would lynch them. And what lynching is hanging. Okay, so and they wouldn't like take this person to a private location and hang them where nobody could see it. They're going to make an example out of this. Okay, and this is, guys, this is exactly, it's terrible and it's awful to talk about, but this is what happens because Reconstruction was ended. You're going to leave the South to its own devices. All right, so that was the first way they were disenfranchised. They were intimidated through violence not to vote, particularly with lynching. Okay, the second way that African Americans are going to be kept from voting, this one's just pretty simple, is fraud. So what fraud means, it's just cheating. So what they would do is they'd say, yeah, sure, come on in and vote. And they would let these African Americans vote. And then as soon as they wrote the name on the ballot, they'd take an eraser out, erase the name, put down the candidate they want. All right. Or sometimes they would say, yeah, vote, let them write their name on it, crumble it up, throw it in the trash can. So fraud, basically, they just, changed or just deleted these African American votes that they had allowed. Now, the last two are probably the sneakiest ways that they're going to try to disenfranchise. Once again, disenfranchise means to take away your right to vote. So, number 3 way that African Americans franchised was through what are called poll taxes. So let's write down poll taxes. Number 3. 3 is what's called a poll tax. And what a poll tax is, that's where you charge a fee to vote. So the way this one worked is pretty simple. Is people be in line to vote. Maybe you got a white American and an African American in line. The white American votes, no problem. African American steps up to vote and they say, that'll be $5, sir. And it might be more than $5. We're just using this as an example here. But the problem was most of these African Americans, they didn't have a lot of money. They were recently freed slaves. They were struggling to find a job, struggling to get by. And so charging this fee is going to drastically reduce the amount of African Americans going to vote. And also, if you're paying attention, they didn't charge the white Americans to vote. This poll tax was used selectively against African Americans. Okay, the final way, and this is just to me just the most ridiculous way. Obviously, violence is the worst, but this one's just ridiculous the way they did this. This 4th way that African Americans are disenfranchised, right down, is called a literacy test. And what a literacy test was, it was basically like a reading test to vote. So what they would do is they would have, like, let's say, once again, you got this white guy in line, and you got this African American in line. They get ready to vote. White guy votes, no problem. African American gets to vote. They slap like a 10-page document on the table. They said, sure, you can vote, but you got to be able to pass this test. You have to be literate. You have to be able to read and write to vote. And now this is not like some simple reading test, like some lower grade level reading test. This is like a college English level reading test. It's super complicated. Some of the questions, and so they were meant to confuse, and if you got any question wrong, you weren't allowed to vote. And understand too, guys, most African Americans were former slaves who weren't educated. They didn't know how to read and write yet, and so slapping them with this huge college level English test is once again going to cut down the amount of African Americans that are allowed to vote. But like we said, once again, poll taxes, literacy tests were not used on white Americans. They were only used on African Americans to keep them from being able to vote. So as you can see, life for these African Americans is very tough in the South. From Jim Crow laws to disenfranchisement, life is tough. And so some African Americans are just going to kind of get fed up with it, and they're going to leave. And you really can't blame them. And this group, these people that leave, they're going to be called the Exodusers. All right, the root word Exodus, if you're trying to think of an easier way to remember what these people are, the root word of this word right here is Exodus. And what Exodus is, an Exodus is when you leave somewhere. Like when the bell rings, you exodus the classroom. If you've ever read the book of the Bible, Exodus, it's a story about how the Israelites are exodusing, how they're leaving Egypt for the Promised Land. But who the Exodus are, they're African Americans who leave the South for the North. And they do this to escape these Jim Crow laws. So your exodusters are going to be groups of African Americans who are going to join together and they're going to leave. And you can't blame them. You know, life wasn't perfect in the North, but it was a lot better than these racist laws were in the South. And the leader of these exodusters is going to be this guy named Benjamin Pap Singleton. And Pap was kind of his nickname, old Pap. And this is Pap Singleton right over here, his picture. He's got a great goatee that he's rocking there. And this other picture on the side, this would have been a sign that Pap Singleton would have used to encourage people to move with him, to leave, to Exodus. And we're going to talk about that. So Pap Singleton, like we said, who he is, let's just write down first. Let's do a little arrow down here. Put down that he is the leader of what's called the Black Exodus. So he's going to be the leader of this Black Exodus. So what Pap Singleton does is he goes around and he recruits African Americans to leave the South for the North. And he's going to have a lot of people who are going to do this. I'm not going to lie, if I was an African American during this time period, I would strongly consider this if I had the ability to do it, because you're going to go to a better life. Now, nowhere is going to be perfect. There's still going to be racist attitudes at this point in American history, but it's going to be better than dealing with Jim Crow laws in the South. So where the Exodusters end up going, you can see it over here in the sign, is they end up actually going to Kansas. All right, so let's just put down that he leads African Americans from Middle Tennessee to Kansas. And so if you're going to join the Exodusters, you had to pay a small fee, okay? And the fee is used to buy this new land. And so Pat Singleton is able to, get enough African Americans together who pay enough of the fees, and he literally buys a small town in Kansas. And these African Americans leave and they move to Kansas. They found their own town. And I mean, I'm sure they were still subject to racist attitudes, but life was so much better for them in the North. And that's why most of these African Americans are going to leave.